Hello guys, this time we are going to look at the positions about the pawn breaks and we'll be analyzing them a little bit more deeper because the positions are a little bit more advanced. Therefore I'll just give you a little bit more insight and I guess you will learn a way more. Some of the positions may seem a little bit complex at first, but you'll see that they are not so difficult if you just divide them into the elements and you'll be analyzing them one by one. Let's get into this one. And here we have the first position. Let's check it out what's going on here. As we can see, both pawns are sitting on the 7th and on the 5th ranks. The pawns are sitting straight, therefore there are no easy way to break through unless we have a double attack. And how to make this double attack at this position? First of all, let's check it out. What pawns would be attacking the other two pawns at the same time? If you push the pawn forward from the f5 to f6, it's going to be just a single attack. After the pawn moving forward h5, h6, another single attack. The only way to make a double attack, to make more dynamic position at this one, is just pushing the pawn forward in the middle of these pawns. Therefore, let's get into this mess. The g6 pawn attacks two pawns at the same time, and now we have two recaptures. Why? Because there are two threats to capture the pawn and move into the promotion, therefore black must recapture. After the recaptures from the f file, we need to remove the guard from the g7, therefore we push the pawn h6 to make it happen. After the pawn captures, the pawn moving forward and the pawn promotes, as the king is too far away from the pawn to catch it. And now what happens if the other pawn captures? Let's check it out. After the pawn captures from the h file, we have the pawn that doesn't have any pawn at the h file, therefore we move the pawn from the f file. And now after the pawn captures from the g to f6, the pawn on the h file is completely free to go, and in a moment it's going to be promoted. Therefore at this moment a double attack makes the position winning. And now another position. What's going on at this one, you may ask? Let's check it out, the most advanced pawns by white. As we can see, the pawn is pretty much close to the promotion. If we just draw the square of the pawn, we can see the king cannot get into the square of the pawn quickly. And therefore, at this moment, if we just make a breakthrough, it's going to give us the opportunity to win. White starts and win. They push the pawn forward to unblock the path from the h file, and therefore, after the pawn captures, we just move the pawn forward, and even if the pawn moves into the promotion as well, we can have this idea about checkmate in two moves, or if it is not going to happen, we can always get with the queen into the g file, and in a moment we'll just capture the pawn on the g2 or g1 after the promotion. Another one, this time we have the pawns that are way closer to the promotion, and as we can see, we have a single attack. If you just make a double attack, most often the time it gives you the opportunity to break through due to the dynamics of the position. And now white start to play. g6 is the way to go. Why is that? Because they want to unblock the path to the pawn from h6. At the same time, they are just making two opportunity to captures on the g7 and on h7. And now if they capture from the h file, the pawn moves forward. Next move is the promotion. If they capture another way, after the pawn captures from g6 to h7, again, the king is too far away to catch the pawn. And lastly, if they get into the f file by the king, white captures the pawn and the king cannot approach the pawn neither g8, neither g7, therefore the pawn promotes next move. And now another one, that we can see that the pawn on the a file doesn't have any pawns on its path. But of course, if it goes immediately, the pawn from the b file is going to capture the pawn. Therefore, first we just need to remove this guard. After the pawn c4, c5, we are attacking the pawn on the b6, threatening to capture and run to the promotion. After the captures, the king gets closer, but in a moment we are having the other pawn that is protecting this one, and then the king cannot approach it even further, because if the king gets to c5, the pawn runs to the promotion, and if the king gets the other way, then the white king will approach closer and it's going to be a checkmate. Therefore, this idea is not going to help black. And let's back into the main idea. Now, we can have the threat of capturing the pawn, therefore black can play b5. At this moment, they can play b5, but at this idea, they can push the pawn forward, and after the pawn gets to promotion, we need to be careful. Why? because black has 3 moves to promotion and white has the same number of the moves to get there. Therefore, first we are just bringing the king closer. After the pawn move forward, we are just getting into the square of the pawn. And if the pawn gets into the promotion, we capture the new queen. And in a moment, of course, the white pawn on the a file is getting to the promotion easily. And now the last idea, if I just capture the pawn from b6 to c5, we are getting to promotion. And again, if the pawn moves forward, we are just into the square of the promotion. Therefore, we can move forward. After the pawn gets here, as we can see, we cannot move to the promotion with the white pawn because black pawn is going to be making the promotion with check. Therefore, first we need to get into the square of the pawn, and after that we promote the pawn on the a file, winning this endgame. Now another position. What's going on in this one, you may ask? First of all, we can see the idea that the f pawn is the most advanced and doesn't have any pawns on its path. At the same time, it's not fixed like the pawn on h4. Therefore, what is going on here? We need to see that we can have some ideas to implement in this position. First is just make more dynamics in the position. More dynamics means more captures. We push the pawn g4. What is the idea? The idea being, if the pawn captures on g4, then the pawn on the h file doesn't have any pawns on its path. And now there are a few options to consider. Let's consider the first option with capturing the pawn. After that, as we can see, the pawn from h file is going into the promotion unless the pawn g6 is capturing this on h5. That's why we need to sacrifice another pawn. For the idea of capturing and getting into promotion, black needs to recapture, and now after h5, the king is too far away to capture the pawn, and therefore the pawn gets to the promotion, winning the game. What happens, however, when we are just getting a little bit different idea at this moment? For example, if the king gets to c6, we have the second option, and now we have the king that is closer to the pawn break zone. And now, if white plays f5, again, first of all, there is the threat of capture and moving the pawn forward to the promotion, and now at this moment, black has 3 replies. The first being the simplest, to capture the pawn. After that, we do not have the pawn on g6, therefore we can capture the pawn on h5 and running to the promotion. Of course, as we can see, the other pawn moving to the promotion is not this fast, because we are just having the b2 square controlled by the new promoted queen. And therefore, after f5, if they capture the pawn, we are just getting to the promotion with the pawn from g to h file. And now, another one, if the king gets closer, we are just capturing the pawn, and if the king gets any closer, we just recapture, and as we can see, the king is in the path of the b pawn, therefore it is pretty easily winning. And the last idea, after the pawn f5, if they make the idea of getting with the pawn from h to g4 to capture, we just capturing here, and again the pawn from g6 is coming to the promotion, and the pawn from b file is too slow. Another one, at this moment, as we can see, there are 3 pawns by black versus 3 pawns by white. But take notice, the pawns on the c file are doubled. Therefore, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to hold such position due to the pawn weaknesses. And now, black to play and win. How they can do it? First of all, they push the pawn forward in order to make a breakthrough, more dynamics in the position, because in a moment if they push the pawn from a4 to a3, it's going to be a double attack. And now, the simplest variation. If they capture the pawn, then we are just sacrificing another pawn, the guarding one, to c3. After the pawn captures, the a pawn advance, therefore game over. And now, let's have a look another variation. If white gets with the king closer in order to capture the pawns, one of the pawns make a breakthrough. And now the king cannot approach the pawn on the diagonal, therefore after the capture, we just recapture, and after the king captures back, the pawn advance, and now in a moment it's going to be promoted. Next position. This time way more difficult, because a little bit more ideas that are into this position at the same time. First of all, we can see 3 pawns versus 2 idea. The pawn on the f file doesn't have the pawn on its path, but of course the guarding pawn that we need to deal with. And now, first idea is to make more dynamics. Therefore, white pushes the pawn on g5. At the same time, after pushing the pawn on f6, it's going to be double attack. Therefore, then it's going to be more dynamics. This is what we are trying to reach at such type of endgames. And now, 3 replies of black. Either the pawn captures the pawn, either the king gets to d6, either the pawn gets to h5. We'll just check out all of them one by one. First, if the pawn moves forward from h5, it's going to be a little bit different than the pawn g5. Why is that? Because after king d6, we're pushing the pawn g5. King e7 is getting closer. After the pawn forward check, we just capture. And after the pawn recaptures, king f7. And now the white pawns are pretty much stacked, because if they move forward, the king simply catches them. Therefore, it's not a win. After g5, if they capture with the h pawn, now we have few choices. The simplest is just to recapture and move the pawn forward, with the idea of deflecting the pawn and moving the pawn from the h file to g and from the g file to the promotion. And now, what happens if they play f6? As we can see, we are just threatening to capture the pawn on the g7 and then promoting. Therefore, we need to be careful. After the pawn captures, the pawn h is pretty much going to promotion, because the king is too slow to get into the square of the pawn. Therefore, it's going to be the win. And now, after hg5, we have another ideas. Instead of that, they can get with the king, not capturing on g5, but getting closer with the king. What then, you may ask? After the pawn f6, as we can see again, the threat of capture and promotion is the first one, the simplest one, and therefore black needs to deal with this somehow. First idea is to capture. After the capture, the pawn captures on the h file, and now in a moment the pawn getting to the promotion, because the king cannot get into the square of the pawn. Therefore, at this moment, white wins comfortably. And now, another variation, instead of capturing the pawn on the square f6, is getting closer with the king. And now, what happens? The pawn captures on g7, and now the next move is the promotion, therefore black needs to deal with that. After king f7, we just capture another pawn, and now the king cannot approach the pawn from the g file, because the pawn from g7 makes the promotion immediately. Therefore, at this moment, they get with the b pawn, trying to make the pawns with the idea to get into the promotion with one pawns due to the swimming square. And now, at the same time, the king gets into the square e3 to wait for these pawns to go. And after the pawn bets to b4, king d3, and now in a moment, one of the pawns is going to be captured. Of course, if the pawn gets into this square with check, we just capture. And after the capture, take notice, if the pawn gets closer, the king gets into the square of the pawn on the diagonal, catching the pawn. Therefore, it's not going to help. And after king d3, if black gets king g8, trying to wait for white to do something, white king gets into one of the pawns, threatening to capture, and if the other pawn moves forward, they capture that, and it is the same situation as previously, but with the mirrored position. In a moment, if the pawn moves forward, the king is catching, it's moving onto the diagonal, and in the promotion square, the queen is not protected, therefore a simple win. And therefore, at this moment, as you can see, a win is pretty straightforward, and that's why we can get from the beginning. One more time, after the pawn gets from g5, let's check out what happens after the pawn gets h5. Because at this moment it seems like there is no pawn breakthrough easily done by white. Of course, it's not like that, because the pawn on the f file is attacking the pawn on g7, in a moment asking about the breakthrough and promotion, and after the pawn captures, the pawn g6 and the king is too far away from catching the pawn, therefore a pretty easy win. And now one more position. This time, as we can see, the most advanced are the pawns on the fourth rank that are going to the promotion pretty quickly. But if we just push the pawn immediately like that, it's going to happen that after the capture, the king gets to this square and the other pawn cannot make breakthrough. But let's check it out if it is true. After the pawn e3, as we can see, there are two threats: to capture the pawn and promote, or promote without the capture of the pawn. Either of the threats white needs to deal with. Now, after the capture, if we capture at this moment, the king captures back, and now white would be winning. But of course, they need to get a little bit different. Black plays the pawn f3, attacking the pawn on the g2 square, and with the idea of capturing and promotion or promotion without the capture. And therefore, again, white needs to react immediately, and after the pawn captures, the pawn moves forward, and as we can see, in a moment the king is not going to reach the pawn due to the obstacle on the diagonal. Therefore, the king goes to e4, and after h3 we can see that the pawn is escaping to the promotion, and white king cannot catch it. Of course, after the h4, if white tries to get a little bit different, for example, if we'd like to make the pawn breakthrough by via aun, we just push the pawn forward, and after the pawn captures, we are getting forward again, and after the pawn forward, we are getting into the square of the pawn, and in a moment we capture the pawn, and our pawn is unstoppable, winning in a moment. And now another position. What's going on here? First of all, as we can see, now we have so-called V structure by white. And now, if black makes the same V structure in a moment, the position will not be possible to break. Therefore, at this moment, it's very easy to see that if we allow black to consolidate, we'll be getting the lost position. And that's why, at this moment, white plays c6, attacking the pawn, threatening to capture and to promote in just 2 moves. And in a moment, black needs to react. How? For example, they either push the pawn forward to b6, to b5, or capture the pawn c6. 3 replies. If they push the pawn up to the b5 square, we capture en passant, and now another threat. The threat is to capture the pawn on promote, or to push the pawn forward from b7 and b8 promoting. Of course, the king is too far away, the king cannot catch the pawn. Another idea would be to go with the pawn to b6 instead of b5, and now at this moment, now white cannot make the capture en passant. But of course, they can capture normally, they can capture the pawn, threatening again the promotion. After the pawn captures, the pawn gets to the 7th rank, in a moment to the 8th rank, and this is the winning endgame. And now one more question. What would it be if we start with the pawn c4 and then trying to make a breakthrough, you may ask? At this moment, as I just mentioned, black plays c6, and now they have the V structure that is not possible to make the breakthrough. We can check it out. After the pawn b5, black king gets to f3. Now, after the pawn captures, they recaptured the symmetrical way, and in a moment the king will capture the pawn on the c files, and now white is completely lost. Therefore, at this position, as we can see, even if black didn't do anything, white cannot make a breakthrough. After the capture on the c6, they recaptured to the symmetrical position. After capture on the a file, they recapture symmetrical positions, and 2 pawns on the c file by white are stopped by 1 pawn black. Therefore, at this position, as you can see, it's not going to be won. And now let's check it out another position. As we can see, this way we have the black that is having the passed pawn and the protected passed pawn. Therefore, white needs to act quickly if they want to win. What's going on at this position, you may ask? First of all, if the pawn on the a7 is missing, then we are just promoting quickly. If the pawn on the a files are removed and the pawn on b6 is removed, again we are just promoting with the b pawn very quickly, because the king is too far away from the pawns on the a and b files. And the idea is the following. This pawn chain is a very strong one, therefore we need to make the lever. How to do so? With the pawn. Attacking the pawn on the c5, threatening to capture, and promote with this pawn chain reaction. And now black has few replies. First reply is to capture with the pawn. What happens then? After that, as you can see, the pawn on the c file doesn't have its counterpart, therefore it can move. After the pushing the pawn forward, again, the threat is to capture, and promote. Therefore, at this moment, black needs to react. After the pawn captures, again, the other pawn is moving forward, making similar threat, and opening the path for the pawn on the a file, and in a moment, the pawn advances with the promotion. What happens if black reacts the other way, you may ask? For example, if I start with the pawn h5, of course this is the best try, and now let's check it out how it continues. After the pawn captures on the square c5, we can see the same plan, and after the pawn moves forward, we capture. They move forward, we capture. They move forward, and now, very important, After the promotion, the queen controls the square of the promotion from the black's pawn, therefore white is winning. What would happen if we get a little bit different? For example, if we just get into this one with capturing the pawn, and then the pawn moves forward, after the captures, the pawn advance, and now as you can see, the pawn gets to the promotion before any of the black's pawns that do the same. Therefore, at this position, it's going to be an easy win. And now let's see what would be the other alternative. For example, if the king gets closer for this group of pawns into this square, because probably, as you can see, if the king is away closer, it's a way easier for the king to have the pawns into the control. And now, after the pawn captures, we have another replies by black. First is the simplest. After the captures back, we move the pawn forward. Again, after the captures, pawn is going to the promotion, the king cannot stop it. Therefore, let's check it out, another option. After king e6, again, if we just capture here, they can get king d7, trying to catch these pawns, especially from the a file. But of course, it's not going to help, because white has too much dynamics. After the captures, again, there is the threat to capture and promote, and now after the pawn recaptures, the pawn advance in a moment and promote next move. And now, after the pawn captures here, if the king gets closer, trying to hide or trying to have these pawns with the path of the pawns blocked, then we are getting into the simple idea of making a double pawns, and these double pawns secure the opportunity for the pawn to promote next move, therefore it's winning anyway. This time the position is a little bit more complicated, but we'll be doing the more deeper analysis. Now, what's going on? First of all, we have 2 pawns versus 1. Therefore, some kind of advantage we need to try to exploit. And now, at the same time, as we can see, the pawn from the g file cannot move to the promotion due to the pawn on h file. And these 2 pawns are pretty dangerous, because if they get into the mode the king cannot capture neither of them, then black is winning. What happens if we start with the incorrect approach? For example, if white starts with b6, then after the capture, the pawn moves forward, but the king catches the pawn running into the diagonal. Therefore, at this moment, if they get closer, the king captures, the pawn moves forward, and now in a moment the king approaches the pawn. The white king cannot capture both of these pawns, and it's going to be too slow to capture the pawn on the h file and running with the g pawn because of the b or c pawns getting into the promotion first. Therefore, it's not going to win. How to win this position though, you may ask. And now at this moment we have the idea of pushing the pawn forward before making the breakthrough. Therefore, a very important idea. First, a6. Why? Because we have the pawns that will be a little bit closer to the promotion, and at the same time the king cannot approach the pawn going into the diagonal due to the pawn b5 having the c6 squares covered. And now a few lines to consider. First, king d6. After that, we are pushing the pawn forward, threatening to capture and to promote. And now 2 replies. After the pawn captures, the pawn moves forward and the pawn is 1 square away from promotion. Black king cannot catch it, therefore the promotion. And another way, if they get a little bit different, if they just approach with the king, the pawn captures, and as we can see previously, therefore the same idea, the double pawns not allow the king to get closer, and the pawn promotes next move. After a6, we can get a little bit different replies. Let's check it out, another one. h6. Now pushing the pawn forward, and after the capture, the same idea as previously. The king cannot reach the pawn because the pawn is too close, therefore game over. And now, of course, if the king gets closer, the same idea as previously, 2 pawns on the same file, not allowing the king to approach the most advanced pawns due to the control of the backward pawn, therefore winning as well. And now after a6, we can have another reply. For example, c4. What then? Again, we are just making the breakthrough with the b pawn, making the threat to capture the pawn and promote. Therefore, at this moment, again, if the king gets closer, the pawn captures like that, as we can see previously, and the pawn a7 promotes next move. After the pawn b6, if they get with the pawn recaptures, again the same idea, next move the promotion, white pawns are too slow. And the last one, after the pawn b6, if they get with the pawn, we just capture the pawn advance, and we promote with check, and in a moment we'll be getting with the king, stopping the other pawn to promote. Therefore, at this moment, this is pretty much easily winning as well. And now this is one of the variations. What happens if we are just getting a little bit different? For example, what happens if they get king c6 immediately after the pawn b6, you may ask. Now, after the capture, the king gets closer, and now it leads to the winning pawn endgame with the edge pawn. Now, after the king captures, the king recaptures, the king gets to b5, and now the idea being to capture the pawn on the c file, then running to the pawn onto the h7 to capture the pawn, not to make any obstacles for the g-pawn, and running with the promotion to the g-pawn, easily winning. Now, after the king gets closer, this is the first variation. Capture, capture, and now getting closer, and as you can see, it's going to be winning, because now white pawn gets to promotion, because the king is securing its path. After the king gets to a6, we can get a little bit different reply. Instead of capturing the pawn by the king, black can stop the pawn from advancing a little bit further. Let's check out if it helps. After h6, the king gets in the same idea, going for the pawn, and after the pawn moves forward, we just capture, and even the same the pawn going to promotion, because the g8 square is covered. Next move, the pawn reaches the last rank. Therefore, it's a win. This time, the position that seems like a little bit difficult for white to do anything, because first of all, the pawn b5 is fixing the pawn b4. After any breaks, the pawn captures, and the pawn gets promotion away faster than the white's pawn. At the same time, very important feature, the pawn gets to promotion, making the new queen with check. Therefore, the king needs to be very, very careful. And now, let's check it out what would happen about this break. After c4, now the pawn captures and both pawns run to the promotion, and now very important idea as we just mentioned. The pawn get to the promotion with check, and the white pawn cannot promote into the back rank because of the check, and in a moment, as we can see, it's going to be captured, but first white simply blocks and then checkmates the king, because the king is completely blocked on the edge of the board. Therefore, a pretty easy win. And that's why at this position, instead of playing c4, they need to get the other idea. They get with the g5. And you may probably now realize why it is that much important. Because after this break, the pawn on g5 would be the natural shield against the check. Therefore, it's going to be the win. And now, black has two replies, two logical ones. If they get into f7, the pawn is going to be captured. If they get into h8, we'll be having the opportunity to make a breakthrough. And now, first one. After king f7, the king captures the pawn, and now in a moment, the king needs to go. The white king captures the pawn, and we have an easy win. What is the other one? Of course, the other one is getting into the corner, and now at this moment, as we can see, we are making the pawn breakthrough. After the first captures, now, as previously, as we can see, the black pawn promotes to the queen, but there is no check due to the pawn on its path. And now, after the check on the back rank, black king doesn't have any legal moves. Therefore, black queen must block, and we just capture and winning. Now, another position. This time, the position seems way more difficult. Therefore, we'll be dividing that into the smaller parts. Therefore, let's check into this one by one. First of all, we have the passed pawn that is having just two squares away from the promotion. But we need to be careful, because the king is inside the square of the pawn. If the pawn moves forward, the king catches this, moving into the diagonal. Therefore, we cannot move the pawn as yet. But there is another idea that we'll need to take into account. Take notice what would happen if the g and f pawns would be gone, and if the pawn would be on h6. Then we'll be having the square of the moving square, and then the pawn are going to win. Therefore, this is the idea that we'll be implementing in this endgame. How to do what? First, we push the pawn forward in order, after the capture, to make this idea work. And now black has a few replies. 3 replies with the king and 3 replies with the pawns. Therefore, let's check it out one by one. First reply, what happens if they capture with the pawn? Now, as we can see, the pawn on the h file doesn't have any pawns on its path, And at the same time, it is the passed pawn, because it cannot be captured by any other pawns of black's. Therefore, at this moment, we push the pawn forward, and now, as you can see, one of the pawns will be getting to the promotion. After the king gets closer, we are moving the pawn. After the king gets the other way, one of the pawn gets into the promotion, and if the king gets into one pawn, the other pawn gets to the promotion safely. Therefore, it's going to be the win. Of course, at this moment, as we can see, we can get the other way. If the king gets into this pawn in a moment, then we can just get the same idea mirrored. After the king gets to g7, the other pawn gets into the promotion, and if the king captures, we are just having the winning endgame. Of course, this is one of the ideas. In a moment, we'll have a look what happens if they get a little bit different. For example, after this one, we can see that one pawn advance. Therefore, it's pretty easy to figure this out. What happens if black will be making more stubborn defense? Now, after the initial position f4, f5, they can get a little bit different. For example, they can push the pawn forward like that. And now, after that, we just capture the pawn with check. Take notice the king cannot capture neither of the pawns because the pawn gets to the promotion, but at the same time, the king cannot get into the square of the pawn because the pawn on f5 is covering e6, pawn on d6 is covering e7. Therefore, a pretty easy loss. After the king captures one of the pawns on d6 promotes easily. Therefore, an easy win for white. Another idea after the pawn f5 is when black will be wasting the time. After a5, the king captures the pawn, and now it is the most stubborn difference. Now, after the pawn recaptures, we have very similar position, but this time we need to be careful to stop the pawn from promoting the black's pawn. And as we can see, if white is to move, they get into one of these squares highlighted blue to reach the pawn to get into the pawn box. And now, after the pawn moves forward, if the pawn runs to the promotion h6, and now the very important idea. Take notice that one of the pawns get to the promoting line due to the rule of the moving square. And now, after the f3, one pawn gets to promotion with check. This is a key idea, otherwise black would be winning. And now, we are just attracting the king and going into the promotion square. Now, very important. After the pawn moves forward, we are going with check. The king must capture. After the pawn gets into the check again, we have the king replies, and now the pawn is going to be captured next move. Of course, if the king gets the other way, let's say if the king gets g7, we are having this idea, and we are just capturing the pawn easily. Therefore, it's winning. What happens if you are getting a little bit different, you may ask. For example, this was one of the variation that was a little bit difficult, but let's check it out. What happens if the king captures the pawn and black replies different way? For example, if I get with the king g7, then with the pawn advanced. Therefore, it's a win immediately. Now, another way, what happens if the king captures the f pawn? Then the pawn promotes easily. After that, as you can see, the king got outside the passed pawn, the king box. Therefore, at this moment, the pawn advanced. And now the one more, after the king e5, and we have the pawn d7. Again, the pawn escapes to the promotion, and it's already winning. And now another position. Let's check it out what happens here. Now, as we can see, the pawns on the H file are pretty much fixed, and now we have the dynamics over the B and A files. The biggest factor that makes this position winning for black is that the king is pretty much stuck on the edge of the board, because the black king cuts off the squares for the white king on the B file. Therefore, the king has only squares to go on the A file. And this factor makes the position winning. First move is king c3. The idea being, of course, to capture the pawn, and after capturing the pawn, if the pawn recaptures, the king gets the other way to capture this pawn, and one of the pawn advance, because white king must capture the passed pawn. And now the king gets closer, and now it is the idea how black is going to win. It looks like that after the repetition of both kings going back and forth, it's going to be a draw. But it is not the case. After the pawn moves forward, we have the biggest dynamics as we previously described in the previous video. Therefore, at this moment, two pawns can capture each other. And now one capture is possible for white pawn from capturing the pawn on B file. We capture with check. And take notice, Now the king has only 2 squares to go. If the king gets backward, we are going here, and now the pawn gets promotion because the pawn will be supported by the king. And now, as we can see, the pawn is promoted to the queen and having the square of the promotion covered. Therefore, after the promotion, we just capture the queen and we are just, of course, winning. Therefore, one idea pretty easily. What happens if the king gets here? It is the same idea as previously, as the pawn advanced to the promotion and we are just controlling the promoting square, therefore winning as well. What happens after the other pawn captures, you may ask? After this pawn captures, it's the same idea. The only difference is the pawn is getting to the promotion on the A file, and after the promotion, we are just checkmating the king. And now the classical position, as you probably remember, this is the position that we already talked about, and now a breakthrough very easily. We are just making a double attack, and now the threat is to capture either of the pawns and promote. The black king cannot reach any of the pawns because it's too far away. And now after the capture, as we can see, the pawn on the F file doesn't have any pawns on its path, therefore it can move forward, but if it moves forward immediately, the guard pawn will just capture this pawn. Therefore, we need to get rid of this guard pawn. After the threat of capturing the pawn and advance, the pawn captures and the pawn advance, easily reaching the last rank. Of course, the other way is what happens if they captured with the H pawn. Again, the same idea, but mirrored. The pawn from the H file doesn't have any pawns on its path, but if it moves immediately, pawn on G7 is going to capture this. Therefore, we are getting rid of this pawn and then promoting. This time, a little bit more advanced because more dynamics into this position. First of all, as we can see, the black king is pretty far away from the pawns, and the pawns are sitting on the 4th and 6th ranks respectively. And as we can see, the biggest dynamics, because these pawns are pretty much having the opportunity to make double attacks. For example, double attack could be done by the pawn f4, f5, attacking 2 pawns at the same time, or with the pawn g5, attacking 2 pawns at the same time. Either of the pawns going into h5 or f5 will be another idea. Of course, f5 is one of the double ideas to make double attack, but this one is just a single capture, therefore it's not going to work. Now, what's going on here? First, we can see the pawn that is the farthest away from the king. This is the square of the pawn. And now, if the pawns are removed, the king cannot catch the pawn because the king is too far away. Therefore, we start with h5. Of course, the threat is to capture and move the pawn forward. Therefore, at this moment, black needs to reply. They either capture the pawn or move the pawn forward. If they don't, the pawn captures immediately. And now, after the captures, we have this idea that now, after the pawn moves forward to the square e5, another one of the threats is done. Now, the threat is to push the pawn forward, capturing the pawn on the f file, and now in the same time, if the pawn promotes on the f8, it's check. Therefore, the pawns going into the capture either on the G or F files, and with the promotion is not going to be with check. This is a huge difference. Therefore, after the capture, again, now we push the pawn forward, threatening to push the pawn up to the F file with check. Therefore, at this moment, they need to react. After they capture, we push the pawn, and now, very important factor, the pawn gets to promotion with check. Otherwise, it's not going to be the win. Of course, at this variation, we can check out one more. For example, what would happen if the pawn captures like that? Then we are just capturing with the pawn right here, and now the same idea applies. Now let's check it out what would be another alternatives after the pawn captures. And now at this moment, instead of capturing the pawn, we can get a little bit different. For example, g5, not allowing the white pawn to capture and attacking the pawn on the f4 as well. And now again, we are just attacking the pawn. We have double attacks, the pawn on the f6 and the pawn on g5, therefore double attack as the dynamics in the endgame position. And now black has two options. Either they capture the pawn moves forward, and again, the same idea with the pawn promoting on the back rank, or the other one is to make with this stuff. The pawn captures on the d file. And now, again, the same idea applies, a a little bit different continuation, but the same idea. We are just getting into the promotion, and again, even if we couldn't, then if the queen gets to the square f2, it controls the promoting square of the black pawn. Therefore, it's going to be the win. And the last variation, let's check it out. What would happen if we just get with this idea? The pawn captures, we are just moving forward, the pawn captures, and now, at this moment, instead of capturing this one, we are getting a little bit different. They can go f5. And now it seems like that they blocked all of the pawns, but it's not true. Why? Because we capture the pawn, again, threatening to push the pawn forward with check, even though this pawn promotes as well. And therefore, after the pawn forward, we are just going with the same idea. Again, the pawn promotes with check, not allowing this pawn to promote. Of course, if they can step back, we can always get with the diagonal, controlling the promoting square, winning the game. Therefore, at this moment, it's a pretty easy win. And now, one more variation I would like to point out very briefly. For example, after the f5, we are just going with the f5. And now, if we just go g5 instead of going to f5, therefore, it's going to be a completely different idea. It is a blunder, as the white pawn doesn't promote with check, and black makes this easily to see. After the captures, the pawn recaptures, and both pawns go to the promotion, and after the white queen promotes, black queen promotes, and now forcing the white queen to block, because the king cannot get anywhere, and now after blocking, it's a checkmate. Therefore, be careful about this variation, because sometimes if you go the wrong way, at this moment, instead of playing f5, if white push the pawn g5, it's a complete loss. Therefore, at the pawn endgames, the precision is required. And now one more position. At this moment, as we can see, the position is a little bit different because we have the pawns that are a little bit pushed forward, and these pawns are pushed forward as well. Therefore, as we can see, a little bit difference from the previous position. But anyway, the position seems very, very similar with the idea of making the breakthrough. First of all, we are just starting with f5. Why is that? Because we need to make the idea to unblock some of the pawns. Therefore, what would be the replies for black? First reply would be the capture, the simplest one. After that, we recapture, and again, there is the promoting, because we have two pawns versus one on these two files, and the idea of making the pawn break is pretty much obvious. After the king gets closer, we are seeing the pawns are too far away, and the king cannot catch it. Therefore, a pretty easy win. Therefore, at this moment, if they capture, the position collapses immediately. What would happen then if they played a little bit different? For example, if they played instead of the capture, if they played the other way. Let's say if they get with the king closer. After that, the pawn moves forward, attacking the pawn on g7, threatening to make the promotion. Therefore, they need to react immediately, and now they need to do it this way. Either the capture, recapture, and after the pawn moves forward, another pawn breakthrough, this time with the pawn g to help the pawn on the h file to get promotion, and after pushing the pawn forward again, we need to do it with the check. Otherwise, black pawns do it with check, and white is no longer winning. Therefore, be careful about the promotion. Of course, at this moment, if they played a little bit different, instead of playing the pawn to e3, if they just capture, we just push the pawn forward, and after this one, again, the pawn promotes with check, of course, stopping the pawn if needed very easily. Therefore, at this moment, after king b4, we have the position that is pretty easily win. Now, what happens after the pawn moves to g5 instead of pawn moving the f6? Take notice, this is the main line we analyzed. This is the transposition to the position that will be going a little bit deeper. Now, after the pawn captures, again, the pawn on the h file doesn't have the pawn on its path, therefore the only guard is the g7 pawn we need to remove. We do it with the other pawn, and after the captures, the pawn gets to the promotion easily. Of course, if the other idea will try to get there, after the g4, pawn captures, and again, the pawn promotes. And now, after this one, let's check it out what happens if black replies the other way. After the pawn captures this way, it is very similar idea as previously. Again, the pawn on the e file doesn't have any pawns on its path. The only problem is the pawn cannot capture its own e6, therefore we are just attacking this guard pawn. And now after the pawn forward, we just capture, and now as previously we can see the pawn promotes with check, easily winning. If the pawn captures, the pawn moves forward, and again the pawn gets here, and now we are just having the pawn's control, promoting square, or capture the pawn immediately. Therefore a pretty easy win. Now another position. This time the position that we partially saw, but it was in a little bit different context, but the idea remains the same. As we can see, 2 pawns versus 1 on the G and H files. If we just moved immediately, if we just move G6 immediately, it loses instantly. Why is that? Because after the captures, the king gets into the square of the pawn, and if the pawn gets even closer, the king doesn't have any obstacles on its path, and now the pawn is captured. Therefore, it's not going to be the win. And now how to do the win at this position. As we can see, in a moment, if black king can get here, or if the pawn promotes earlier than white's, then black wins immediately. Therefore, we need to push the pawn h6 first to get closer to the promotion. And now, after the king gets closer, we are just making a pawn breakthrough. This was the idea. And now, after the king gets closer, we just captured, and again, we can see the power of the double pawns sometimes are pretty much very powerful, because the king cannot catch the h pawn h7 due to the h6 pawn guarding g7, winning. Therefore, at this moment, a very easy win. Of course, as you can see at this moment, after the king gets h6, if white would play g7 to have the pawn protected, it's going to be a huge mistake. Why? Because now black draws comfortably. Because the idea being to get the king going here with protecting the pawn promotion, and if the king gets closer, as we can see, white cannot win this position any longer, even if they capture the pawn, because the idea would be to stalemate. For example, if the king approaches in one of these squares highlighted red, the king doesn't have any moves, and the pawn is fixed, and we cannot make a breakthrough to help this pawn unlocked. Therefore, this position would be just a draw. Therefore, be careful about going into the position winning, that sometimes it's either the capture, either the pushing the pawn forward. You need to distinguish which one is the correct one. Therefore, do not rush. And now, as we can see, one more time, after the pawn h6, one more important notice, the king cannot get closer to reach this pawn h6 in a moment after the breakthrough, because of the other pawn controlling the f6 square, and if the king goes right here, as we can see, the pawn promotes easily and the game is over. And now another idea. This time, let's check it out, what happens if black will be trying to make a breakthrough. Now, it looks like that we have just 5 pawns by black and 5 pawns by white. And now at this time, as we can see, white king is on the 4th rank, black is on the 6th rank. It looks like that white king is way more active. And therefore, in a moment, we need to be careful, because this position is very, very dynamic. Now, first, what would happen if black just makes the simple captures? Would it work or not? After the capture, this is a blunder, because now we are having the positions 2 versus 1. And the idea being, white simply pushes the pawn on h4. After the capture by the g pawn, they capture the pawn on the e file, then capture these 2 pawns, and they are winning easily. Therefore, this is not going to work for black. Therefore, black cannot capture the pawn. They need to go into the other idea. What is this other idea? The other idea is make as most dynamics as possible. As we previously mentioned, this is the most dynamical structure, and now we are getting into the heat of the battle. Now, the idea being to capture the pawn and trying to push forward, or to capture the pawn, and after the recapture, the pawn will be the decoy, and the king will be having this pawn going to promotion stopped very easily. Now, after the pawn captures, the pawn moves forward. And now what then? The king gets closer, because the king wants to control this square of the promotion for the king, for the pawn, sorry. Therefore, they get into the square. And now the king gets down. After the king gets closer, the king gets up. And now, after this one, as we can see, it's going to be a pretty interesting position. Why is that? Because it seems like a Zugzwang, but it's not. After the king f4, as we can see, if the pawn moves forward, immediately the king captures. Therefore, white doesn't benefit out of this. After the king captures back. And now, very important idea. the pawn again promotes with check before white pawns promote as well. Therefore, the pawn raise, and now in a moment, the pawn promotes with check, even though white pawn promotes to queen, but there is the bad position of the white king, and therefore after the check, we are getting into the winning pawn endgame. And now it's pretty easy winning. As we can see, all of the moves are pretty logical, and in a moment, the pawn advance. Of course, at this position, after this chase of the pawns, if they get a little bit different, instead of going into the pawn a3, if they get king d5, it also loses. After the king captures, we are getting here, capture, capture, and now the pawn advance, getting into the promotion. There is one more idea I would like to briefly explain. In this position, starting with, after the pawn g5, there is one more option. After g5, the main variation was just to capture from the pawn from h to g5. What would happen if they capture the other way? If they capture this way, it is the second option. Of course, white loses even simpler. Why? Because as I just mentioned, pawn captures here with the promotion, and now after the pawn move forward, the king gets into the square of the pawn. Therefore, the king is in time, and now as you can see, if the pawn moves forward again, the king gets closer. After the pawn gets here, capture, and the king cannot approach this pawn because of the obstacle. Of course, if they push the pawn forward, we just capture this one. After they capture, we are getting the same idea as previously, therefore a win very easily. Therefore, it is the idea that we apply in this position again. Of course, if they get a little bit different, for example, if they get, instead of pushing the pawn forward after the king e3, we are approaching the pawn, they are approaching both, and now the same idea applies. This time the king captures, but white doesn't have the pawn going to promotion. Of course, if they get, instead of getting king e3, if they get the pawn h7, we are just discussing this, the king captures the pawn easily. And the last position, this time the position that seems very, very tricky, because it seems like that this position must be winning for black immediately, because black has 5 pawns, whereas white has just 2. It seems like, how can you not win this position? It's impossible, isn't it? It looks like, but there is one exception. And this is exception that is super, super interesting, and you need to be careful, because sometimes a huge advantage with the number of pawns may not mean that you are winning. At this moment, as we can see, the pawn is pretty far away from the king. Therefore, if the pawn doesn't have the opponent's path, it's going to be already winning, because the pawn square box is like that, and after pushing the pawn forward, the king cannot approach the pawn box. And that's why the only chance for white is just to push the pawn forward, to unlock the pawn, to unfix it and making the pawn forward. And of course, after the pawn captures, it's winning because the king cannot approach the pawn box, therefore they cannot capture. But what then? Instead of capturing, they need to get closer with the king. Because now, after the pawn moves forward, capture, capture, the king just get into the square of the pawn, black wins easily. And now, they capture the other way. And now, as we can see, the power of the double pawns. Why? Because these double pawns will be having these squares covered. And now the only way to stop the pawn from promoting is getting king f6. And now, as you can see, if the king approaches the pawns from the 5th rank, the pawn is getting to the promotion easily. Therefore, it cannot move. At the same time, the king cannot approach the pawn from getting the other way because of the obstacle of its own pawn. And now the white double pawns cut off the king from the action. And now what about the black pawns? First, the king must block all of these 3 pawns. Now, if either of the pawns move forward, the king captures the pawns. And after c4, the only move that wins in this position is the king c1. And now, as you can see, all of these 3 pawns are standing on the 4th rank. And now the king cannot move because the other pawn gets to promotion. Therefore, one of the black pawns must move. Now, if white pawn gets here, the king gets in front of this pawn. And now, if the pawn moves forward with check, the king captures. And now, at this moment, if the other pawn moves forward, as we can see, the king blocks all of these pawns. One of the pawn on the c4 is simply restricted by blocking. And now, if either of the pawn moves forward, the king captures one of that. Therefore, at this moment, after the pawn moves forward, the king captures. If the pawn moves forward, the king gets into the square of the pawn. The other pawn supports the pawn that is going to promotion, but we are not going to capture. Of course, after the capture, the pawn promotes, black is winning. But it is white that will be going back and forth over this diagonal, and now they will be capturing the pawns, and after the pawn forward, all of the pawns are captured. And now the king must move. After the king moves, the pawn gets to promotion and it's winning. Therefore, a very special example of showing you how sometimes the double pawns can have a huge power and how the king can stop all of the pawns at the same time if they are not supported by the king, and therefore at this moment a very, very nice exception. I hope you understand these positions, and they are going to help you to understand this pawn breakthrough ideas. I hope so. You just learned a lot about the pawn breakthroughs or the pawn breaks, and now you can simply apply these ideas in practice. Take notice that sometimes they are a little bit difficult because you need to check out the variations, check out how the opponent can try to refute your ideas. At the same time, try to think how you can just continue your ideas, but sometimes there may be a little bit of problems to apply this in practice, but with more examples to practice by yourself and more analysis, I believe you can get a way better. And now we are just learned the fundamentals about the pawn ideas, about the pawn concepts, and now I guess you can learn this and you can apply this in your games, and you can just win more games. Remember, if you are just trying to have the positions winning, you need to back up with the ideas. If you do not have the ideas, the calculation doesn't make any sense, but if you have the ideas and you know what ideas you can implement, then the calculation has a lot of sense. Therefore, mostly start with the ideas and then back it up with the calculations, not the opposite. I keep fingers crossed on your success, and thank you very much for watching.